This is completely unacceptable.
I'm very sorry, sir. What can I do?
I want to see the manager.
Right away, sir.
There's a special kind of cruelty that comes wrapped in expensive cologne and a $15,000 watch. Scott Hampson wore both the night he decided to humiliate the waitress standing before him at San Francisco's most exclusive restaurant. He looked at her dirt-stained nails, her worn shoes, and saw her as a classless lowlife, someone he could just take advantage of to feed his ego. He thought to embarrass her by placing his order in an impossibly obscure language. What he didn't know was that that language would be his biggest mistake. This is the story of how a cruel millionaire met his match. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But to really understand how that night unfolded, you need to know where it all began. It started with a sound. Click. 8:47 p.m. Scott Hampson's Patek Philippe watch hit the marble table at the Gilded Lily. Not by accident. Never by accident. It was a statement, the kind of sound meant to make heads turn, to remind everyone within earshot exactly who had money and who didn't. And honestly, the Gilded Lily was the perfect stage for a man like Scott. This wasn't just some restaurant. This was where San Francisco's elite came to see and be seen. 18-foot ceilings. Walls lined with imported bamboo from Japan. A live jazz quartet in the corner playing just loud enough to make every conversation feel important, but never loud enough to drown out the sound of power being exchanged over $200 plates of food. The lighting? Perfectly calibrated. Golden hour, all night long. Everyone looked like they belonged on a magazine cover. And right there, dead center of it all, sat Scott Hampson, 53. Silver hair slicked back with pomade that probably cost more than most people's car payments. His charcoal suit was custom Tom Ford, the kind that didn't wrinkle even after hours of sitting. His date sat across from him, blonde, younger, scrolling through her phone like she'd rather be anywhere else. But honestly, she wasn't the point. The two men sitting on either side of Scott? They were the point. Business associates. The kind of people who didn't just move money, they moved entire markets. One conversation with these guys could buy you a building, maybe a whole block. That's when Deborah Williams appeared. She was carrying a tray of what the menu called amuse-bouches, basically tiny, overpriced bites of food that cost $40 and disappeared in 2 seconds. Seared tuna, microgreens, the kind of thing rich people convinced themselves tasted better because it was expensive. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was calm, practiced, the kind of voice you perfected after months of working in a place like this. Pleasant, but not too friendly. Present, but not intrusive. Invisible, but available. Scott didn't even look up. He kept talking, waving his hand around like he was conducting an orchestra, going on about disruptive markets and scalable opportunities and all the buzzwords wealthy men use to make greed sound innovative. To him, Deborah wasn't even a person. She was just there. Like the furniture. Like the ambient jazz. Something you only noticed if it stopped working. She set the plates down carefully. You learned real quick at the Gilded Lily. One wrong move, one plate that clinked too loud, one moment where you were a little too visible, and you were done. But as she turned to walk away, she felt it. His eyes. Not on her face. Never her face. On her hands. Specifically, on that thin crescent of dirt still stuck under her right thumbnail. The dirt she tried scrubbing out in the employee bathroom but couldn't quite get. The dirt from this morning, from the community garden in Oakland where she'd spent 2 hours with her mom pulling weeds and planting winter vegetables before her shift. The dirt that, to someone like Scott Hampson, meant everything. His lip curled. Just slightly. But enough. And in that split second, Deborah knew exactly what he was thinking. How did someone like you end up serving someone like me? She felt that familiar weight drop onto her shoulders. The weight she'd been carrying for 6 months now. The weight of being a Stanford dropout working a job that made her mother lose sleep. The weight of knowing that every shift, every smile, every yes sir, and right away ma'am, was just one more step towards saving her family's grocery store from being seized. And here's the thing Scott didn't know. He didn't know her name was Deborah Williams. He didn't know she'd left Stanford just 6 credits short of finishing her linguistics degree. He didn't know her grandmother had been a royal translator in Budapest before immigrating to the States. He didn't know that the language he was about to use as a weapon, the one he thought would embarrass her, make her feel small, was the same language her grandmother had whispered to her as a child. The same language she'd grown up hearing at the dinner table, in prayers, in songs. All Scott Hampson saw was dirt under her nails. And to a man like him, that was all he needed to see. Ms. Williams. She turned. Marcus, the floor manager, stood beside her. Mid-40s, graying temples, the kind of man whose entire existence revolved around making sure people like Scott Hampson never had a reason to complain. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but she heard every word. Table 12 needs water. And, he glanced down at her hands. Maybe wash up before you head back out? It wasn't a suggestion. Deborah nodded, swallowing the words sitting on the tip of her tongue, and headed toward the kitchen. Behind her, Scott Hampson laughed. But the kind of laugh that filled up a room and reminded everyone exactly who had the power. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that his night was about to take a turn he never saw coming. And it all started with a language he thought nobody else could speak. The kitchen was chaos. Steam hissing from the dishwasher. Chefs barking orders in 3 different languages. The metallic clang of pots and pans, the sizzle of oil, the constant beeping of timers. It was the kind of noise that should have drowned out everything else. But somehow, Deborah could still hear Scott Hampson's laugh echoing in her head. She stood at the sink, scrubbing her hands for the 3rd time, watching the soap foam turn gray as she dug her nails into the bar. The dirt was mostly gone now. Mostly. But she could still see the faint shadow of it, the reminder of where she'd been that morning. The community garden. Her mom's hands in the soil, planting seeds for a harvest they might not even be around to see. Because in 3 weeks, if Deborah didn't come up with $8,000 for the property taxes, the city was going to seize their family's grocery store. The one her grandfather had opened in 1987. The one that had survived recessions, riots, and every economic downturn Oakland had thrown at it. The one that couldn't survive Thorn Development Group. Deborah turned off the faucet and stared at her reflection in the stainless steel backsplash. 24 years old. Bags under her eyes from working double shifts. Hair pulled back so tight it gave her headaches. This wasn't supposed to be her life. 2 years ago, she'd been at Stanford. Linguistics major. 3.8 GPA. 6 credits away from graduating. She'd had internship offers, research opportunities, a future that looked nothing like this kitchen. And then her mom got sick. Not dying sick. Not yet. But the kind of sick that meant someone needed to be there. The kind that meant medical bills and missed work and tough decisions about what mattered more, a degree or family. Deborah had made her choice. She dropped out. Came home. Picked up shifts wherever she could, first at a diner in Oakland, then at a catering company, and finally here at the Gilded Lily, where the tips were good enough to almost keep them afloat. Almost. Williams. She turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face tight with that particular brand of stress that came from managing rich people's expectations. "You good?" he asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was a warning. "I'm fine," Deborah said, drying her hands. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice so the line cooks wouldn't hear. "Look, I need you to be better than fine tonight. That table, table 7, that's Scott Hampson. The name hit her like cold water. She knew that name. Everyone in Oakland knew that name. Scott Hampson, lead investor, Thorne Development Group, the man whose company had bought up half her neighborhood in the last 18 months. The man whose signature was on the notices taped to her family's store, the notices that said redevelopment opportunity but meant displacement. Her throat went tight. I didn't realize that was him. Yeah, well, now you know. Marcus crossed his arms. He's here with some big investors from Europe. This dinner? It's a deal worth millions. And if anything goes wrong, if the service is slow, if the food isn't perfect, if he so much as frowns, it's on me. Which means it's on you. Deborah nodded slowly, her heart pounding. I'm serious, Williams. One mistake with a guy like Hampson and you're out. I can't protect you. He paused, his expression softening just slightly. I know you need this job. So please, just keep your head down. Be invisible. Get through tonight. Be invisible. She'd spent 6 months perfecting that skill. 6 months of swallowing her pride, biting her tongue, playing the role of the grateful employee who was just happy to be there. But standing in that kitchen, knowing that the man sitting 20 feet away was the same man destroying her family's livelihood, being invisible felt like betrayal. I understand, Deborah said quietly. Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. Table 7 needs their drink order taken. They've been waiting 5 minutes. He walked away, back into the dining room, leaving Deborah alone with the sound of her own breathing and the relentless noise of the kitchen. She looked down at her hands. Clean now. No trace of dirt, but she could still feel it there. The weight of the soil. The weight of her family's history. The weight of everything she was trying to save. And for just a moment, Deborah let herself imagine what it would feel like to walk out of this kitchen, march up to Scott Hampson's table, and tell him exactly who she was. Tell him what his redevelopment was really doing. Tell him that the dirt under her nails wasn't shame, it was proof that she'd been fighting for something real while he'd been playing with other people's lives. But she didn't. Instead, she picked up her notepad, straightened her apron, and walked back into the dining room. Because that's what you did when you needed the money. You swallowed your pride. You became invisible. You survived. At least, that's what she thought. Until she reached table 7, and Scott Hampson looked up at her with that same sneer, and opened his mouth to speak in a language he thought would break her. As Deborah walked toward table 7, something shifted inside her. A memory. She was 8 years old again, sitting cross-legged on her grandmother's kitchen floor in their small apartment in Oakland. The smell of paprikash simmering on the stove. The afternoon light streaming through lace curtains her grandmother had brought from Budapest 50 years earlier. Ismetel Dutanum, her grandmother would say. Repeat after me. And Deborah would repeat. The words felt strange in her mouth at first. Hungarian wasn't like English. The sounds were sharper, more precise. Every syllable mattered. Her grandmother, Esther, had been a royal translator back in Hungary before the revolution. She'd worked in government buildings, translating for diplomats and ministers. She carried herself like royalty even in their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, even when she was cleaning houses to make ends meet. Language is power, Kixim, she'd tell Deborah. My little one. The way you speak tells people who you are, where you come from, what you're made of. Deborah's mother continued that legacy. Dr. Elena Williams, professor of Eastern European linguistics at Berkeley before the funding cuts forced her into adjunct work, then eventually into running the family grocery store full-time when Deborah's grandfather got too sick to manage it alone. Growing up, their dinner table was a library. Conversations flowed between English and Hungarian without warning. Her mother would quiz her on verb conjugations while passing the potatoes. Her grandmother would correct her pronunciation between bites of chicken. Deborah didn't grow up with money. Their apartment was small. Her clothes were hand-me-downs. But she grew up rich in something else. The power of the tongue, as her grandmother called it. The ability to move between worlds, to understand not just words but the weight they carried, the history embedded in every phrase. By the time she was 12, Deborah could hold full conversations in Hungarian. She understood the formal register used in business, the casual slang of the streets, the poetic language of literature. She knew that Hungarian wasn't just a language, it was a system of respect, a map of relationships, a way of seeing the world. But being 12 also meant wanting to fit in. She remembered the day she asked her mother to stop speaking Hungarian at school pickups. She was 13. Some kids had made fun of the way her grandmother spoke English, the thick accent that turned W's into V's. "Please, Mom," Deborah had begged. "Can't we just be normal?" Her mother's face had fallen. Not angry, just sad. "Normal," she'd repeated quietly. "You think hiding who you are makes you normal?" Deborah had felt the shame even then. But teenage shame was a powerful thing. For years, she'd downplayed her language skills. Pretended she didn't understand when her grandmother spoke Hungarian in public. Rolled her eyes when her mother tried to teach her about their heritage. It wasn't until her grandmother died, Deborah was 16, that she realized what she'd been rejecting. At the funeral, people came from all over the Bay Area. People her grandmother had helped translate documents for, people she'd tutored in English, people whose citizenship papers she'd filled out for free in their living room. One old man, a Hungarian immigrant who'd arrived in the 80s, took Deborah's hand. "Your grandmother," he said in Hungarian, "she didn't just teach me English. She taught me dignity. She taught me that my language wasn't something to hide. It was something to honor." Deborah had cried then. Really cried. Because she understood what she'd lost. Not just her grandmother, but years of connection she'd thrown away because she wanted to blend in. She'd spent the next few years trying to reclaim it. Learning everything she could. That's why she'd chosen linguistics at Stanford. To understand language not just as communication, but as power, as heritage, as resistance. And now, walking towards Scott Hampson's table, Deborah felt her grandmother's hand on her shoulder. Language is power, Kixim. She'd forgotten that for a while. She wouldn't forget again. Scott Hampson was in his element. His two European associates, investors from a Berlin-based tech consortium, sat on either side of him, watching him perform. And that's what this was. A performance. So, as I was saying, Scott continued, swirling his $300 glass of wine, the Oakland redevelopment project is a gold mine. We're talking prime real estate currently occupied by, he paused, choosing his words carefully, legacy businesses that haven't adapted to market realities. Legacy businesses. That's what men like Scott called family stores that had served their communities for decades. Deborah approached the table, notepad ready. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. "Can I start you off with?" Scott held up his hand. Didn't even look at her. "Actually," he said, turning to his associates with a smile, "I've been practicing something. A little party trick I picked up during my travels." One of the investors, a stern-looking woman named Petra, raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you see, I believe that true sophistication means understanding cultures beyond your own. Not just visiting them, understanding them." He leaned back, clearly enjoying himself. "For instance, I spent 3 months in Budapest last year. Fascinating city. And I picked up quite a bit of the language." Deborah's hand tightened on her notepad. "So, if you'll indulge me," Scott said, finally looking at Deborah, but not at her face, never her face, at that spot just past her shoulder where servants existed, "I'd like to order in Hungarian." The table went quiet. Scott cleared his throat, and when he spoke, The words came out mangled and harsh. Saratnik. He paused, butchering the pronunciation. Karam a Huslivs, de Valami Oliet, amit egi Parist Deborah's blood went cold. He just said, roughly translated, I want the meat soup, but something a peasant would eat. But it was worse than that. The way he'd pronounced it, mixing modern slang with archaic formal terms, made it sound intentionally crude. Like he was trying to make Hungarians sound primitive. Low class. And then he continued. He grinned at his associates. Manja megasakaksnak, hogi eni pazarolja are az arafesidist. Ez sak egi ejisur tanir. Tell the chef not to waste effort. It's just a simple plate. Except the word he used, ejisur, he'd pronounced it wrong. Deliberately wrong. The way someone might mock an accent. Scott sat back, arms crossed, waiting. The trap was set. He expected her to look confused. To stammer. To prove his point that she was just a waitress, just another person who didn't understand the sophisticated world he occupied. He wanted her to ask him to repeat himself in English. Wanted the moment where he could turn to his associates and explain, in his smug, condescending tone, what he'd just said. Wanted to demonstrate his worldliness, his cultural superiority. Petra shifted uncomfortably. The other investor, Klaus, looked down at his menu. But Scott? Scott was practically glowing. This was what he lived for. These little moments where he could remind everyone in the room that he was smarter, richer, better. The silence stretched. Deborah stood there, notepad in hand, her face carefully neutral. Inside, her heart was pounding. Not from fear. From rage. Because this wasn't just about ordering food. This was about her grandmother's tongue. Her mother's language. Her heritage. And Scott Hampson had just weaponized it for his own entertainment. The dining room felt smaller suddenly. Like the walls were closing in, like the golden light was dimming, like the jazz quartet in the corner had stopped playing even though Deborah could still hear the distant notes of a saxophone. Everything narrowed to this moment. This table. This man. Scott was still smiling. That satisfied, predatory smile of someone who thought he'd already won. Well, he said, switching back to English. Did you get all that, or should I? He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Or should I repeat it in a language you can actually understand? Deborah's hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just enough that she had to grip her notepad tighter to keep it from showing. 6 months. 6 months of invisible. 6 months of swallowing her pride, of taking insults with a smile, of playing the role of someone small and grateful and powerless. Because that was survival. But standing here, listening to Scott Hampson butcher her grandmother's language, not just butcher it, but mock it, make it sound crude and unsophisticated for the entertainment of his investors, something inside her cracked. The waitress mask. The one she'd worn so carefully, so completely. It was slipping. She thought about her grandmother, Esther, who'd translated for ministers and never once lowered herself for anyone. Who'd cleaned houses in America but spoke Hungarian like royalty because that's what she was, linguistic royalty. She thought about her mother, Dr. Elena Williams, who'd given up a tenured track position to keep the family store alive, who still spoke 3 languages fluently while running a cash register. She thought about the grocery store. Her grandfather's legacy. The place where Oakland families had bought bread and milk and hope for 37 years. The place that Thorne Development, Scott Hampson's company, was trying to erase. And she thought about the community garden. Her hands in the soil this morning. Her mother planting seeds for a harvest they might never see because men like Scott decided that their neighborhood wasn't valuable enough in its current state. The silence at the table was getting uncomfortable now. Petra glanced at Klaus. Klaus studied his water glass like it held answers. But Scott? Scott was loving this. He leaned back in his chair, that smile widening. In his mind, Deborah's silence was confirmation. Proof that she didn't understand. Proof that he was exactly as sophisticated and worldly as he claimed to be. "You know what?" he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. "It's fine. Not everyone has the opportunity to learn multiple languages. I'll just order in English like everyone else. Like everyone else. Translation, like everyone else at your level." And that's when something clicked inside Deborah. She'd been playing small because she thought it would save her store. Thought if she could just earn enough money, keep this job long enough, she could somehow scrape together the property taxes and hold on to her family's legacy. But standing here, watching Scott Hampson mock her grandmother's tongue while simultaneously destroying her neighborhood, Deborah realized something crucial. Playing small wouldn't save anything. Men like Scott Hampson didn't respect humility. They interpreted it as weakness. They took and took and took until there was nothing left to take, and then they moved on to the next target. You couldn't save your dignity by surrendering it. You couldn't protect your heritage by hiding it. Deborah looked down at her hands. No dirt under her nails anymore. But she could still feel it there. The weight of the soil. The weight of 3 generations of scholars and fighters and survivors. And she made a choice. She looked up. Not at Scott's shoulder. Not at the space just past him where waitresses were supposed to look. At his eyes. Direct. Unflinching. And she spoke. Megar Tedem. The word came out clear. Precise. Perfect. I understood. Scott's smile faltered. Just for a second. Deborah continued, her voice gaining strength, gaining resonance, gaining something that made everyone at nearby tables turn to look. AZT Monta, Hoggy Suretten a Huslavest. Derkijis. She paused, letting the silence build. Erdex Volt. You said you'd like the meat soup, but your pronunciation was interesting. The room felt different now. The jazz had actually stopped. The conversations at other tables had quieted. Even the kitchen noise seemed distant. Scott's face was hardening. I don't think. Latja, Deborah continued in Hungarian, her tone polite but firm. Amica ezidi monta perist? When you said peasant, the tonal quality you used actually changed the meaning. You weren't ordering food. You were using an archaic insult typically reserved for. She paused, switching to English so everyone could understand. Well, for people you consider beneath you. Petra's eyes widened. Furthermore, Deborah continued, her Hungarian now flowing with the formal register used in royal courts, the way you pronounced ijisser, simple, you dropped the tonal marker. In Hungarian, that changes the word from simple to something closer to worthless. Klaus set down his wine glass carefully. Scott's face was reddening. Now wait just a... But perhaps the most interesting part, Deborah said, her voice steady, resonant, filling the space like her grandmother's once had, was your grammar structure. You mixed 19th century formal Hungarian with modern street slang. Do you know what that communicates to an actual Hungarian speaker? The table was silent. It communicates that you learned Hungarian from an app. Probably for about 3 weeks. Not 3 months in Budapest. 3 weeks on your phone. The words landed like stones in water. Ripples spreading across the table, across the room. Scott shot to his feet. How dare you? There's a saying in Hungarian, Deborah continued, unshaken. Van aki tudja szavakat, yes van aki erdi jelentist. She let the words hang in the air before translating. Some people know the words. Some people understand the meaning. She turned to Petra and Klaus, her voice softening but losing none of its power. My grandmother was a royal translator in Budapest. She worked with ministers, diplomats, scholars. She taught me that Hungarian isn't just a language, It's a system of respect, a map of relationships, a code of ethics embedded in every sentence. Every tonal choice you make tells the listener how you see them, how you see yourself. Deborah looked back at Scott. And what you just said, Mr. Hampson, tells me everything I need to know about how you see people. You used my grandmother's language as a weapon. You tried to make it sound primitive to impress your guests. You thought you were demonstrating sophistication. She leaned in slightly. Not aggressive, just present. Fully present. But all you demonstrated was that you're a man who uses culture as a costume, who treats languages like trophies, who thinks knowing a few words makes you worldly when really, she paused, it just makes you a tourist. The silence was deafening. Scott's hands were trembling with rage. His face had gone from red to almost purple. The silver hair, the expensive suit, the $15,000 watch, none of it mattered now. He'd been exposed, not just as someone who didn't speak Hungarian as well as he claimed, but as someone who used culture as a weapon, who looked down on the very people whose languages he claimed to respect. Petra pushed back from the table slightly. Klaus was staring at Scott like he was seeing him for the first time. And Deborah? Deborah stood tall. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't invisible. She was seen. You're fired. Scott's voice was shaking. Not with authority. With humiliation. I want her fired. Right now. Marcus. He was shouting now, loud enough that the entire restaurant was staring. Get over here. Marcus appeared within seconds, his face pale. Behind him, 2 security guards stood at attention. Mr. Hampson, Marcus began, his voice careful. Is there a problem? A problem? Scott laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your waitress just insulted me in front of my business associates. She was insubordinate, disrespectful, and... He paused, his eyes landing on Deborah with a look of pure venom. And I want her arrested. Arrested? Marcus looked confused. Sir, I don't think... Check her pockets, Scott demanded. He reached into his jacket, patting the pockets dramatically. His face shifted from rage to theatrical shock. My wallet. It's missing. She stole my wallet. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Deborah felt the floor tilt beneath her. I didn't. Search her, Scott demanded, pointing at the security guards. Now. Klaus and Petra exchanged glances. There was a third person at the table, an older Japanese man who'd been silent the entire evening. He hadn't said a word during Scott's performance, hadn't reacted visibly when Deborah spoke. Now he sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Marcus looked at Deborah, his eyes apologetic but firm. Ms. Williams, I'm going to have to ask you to... No. The word came out stronger than Deborah expected. I didn't take anything, she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. And I'm not letting anyone search me based on a false accusation. Scott's smile was cruel. So you're refusing? That sounds like guilt to me. It sounds like dignity, Deborah shot back. You're lying. You know you're lying. And I won't participate in this performance. She could see the calculation in Scott's eyes. He'd been outclassed linguistically. His sophisticated image had been shredded in front of his investors. So now he was pivoting to plan B, destroy her completely. Get her fired. Get her arrested. Make her pay for embarrassing him. Men like Scott Hampson didn't just lose. They obliterated anyone who made them look small. The security guards stepped forward. Ms. Williams, one of them said quietly, please cooperate. We can do this easy or... Wait. The voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. Everyone turned. The silent Japanese man at the table had finally spoken. He stood slowly, his movements precise and deliberate. He was older, maybe 70, with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit that made Scott's look cheap by comparison. "Mr. Sato," Scott said quickly, his tone shifting to something almost desperate. "I apologize for this disruption. Once we have her removed, we can—" "You have not lost your wallet, Mr. Hampson." The words were simple, factual, devastating. Scott's face went rigid. "Excuse me?" "I watched you," Mr. Sato continued, his English impeccable but accented. "Approximately 7 minutes ago. You removed your wallet from your jacket pocket, examined it briefly, and placed it into your inside coat pocket. The left side." The silence that followed was absolute. "That's—" Scott's hand went automatically to his coat. His face drained of color. "I suggest you check," Mr. Sato said calmly. Scott reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around leather. He pulled out his wallet. The restaurant held its breath. Scott stood there, wallet in hand, his face cycling through emotions. Shock, rage, humiliation, calculation. I must have forgotten," he stammered. You thought you would destroy this young woman's life because she embarrassed you," Mr. Sato said. His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "You attempted to have her arrested for a crime you knew she did not commit." Petra stood abruptly. "I think we're done here." "Wait," Scott said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Let's not be hasty. This was just a misunderstanding. We can still—" "Mr. Hampson," Klaus interrupted, his German accent thickening with anger, "we came to San Francisco to evaluate your character as much as your business proposal. This evening has been illuminating." "The Thorn development deal," Petra added, gathering her things, "is off the table. We will not partner with a man who weaponizes culture and false accusations." Scott's face went from red to white. "You can't be serious. This is a multi-million-dollar deal. Over a waitress." "Over ethics," Klaus corrected. "Something you seem to lack entirely." They walked away, leaving Scott standing alone, his wallet still in his hand, his empire crumbling around him. Mr. Sato turned to Deborah. "Ms. Williams," he said, his voice formal but kind. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Deborah nodded, still processing what had just happened. Mr. Sato reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card. The paper was thick, expensive, embossed with gold lettering. "My name is Kenji Sato. I am the director of the Sato Cultural Initiative, an organization dedicated to preserving cultural heritage in the face of technological expansion." He handed her the card. "We operate throughout Asia, Europe, and now, increasingly, in North America." Deborah took the card with shaking hands. "I have been searching," Mr. Sato continued, "for someone to lead our North American division. Someone who understands that culture is not a costume. That language is not a weapon. That heritage is worth fighting for." He gestured to the now empty table where Scott had sat. "What I witnessed tonight was not just linguistic fluency. It was cultural integrity. It was courage. It was exactly what my organization needs." He paused. "I would like to offer you the position of Director of Cultural Integrity for our Western operations. The salary is $120,000 annually, with benefits, travel, and the resources to protect places like—" He smiled slightly. "Like your family's grocery store." Deborah's throat closed. She couldn't speak. "I understand this is sudden," Mr. Sato said gently. "You do not need to answer tonight. But I want you to know, what that man tried to destroy, I see as invaluable." Marcus appeared at Deborah's side, his expression stunned. "Ms. Williams," he said quietly, "you're not fired. Obviously. And I—" He looked genuinely shaken. "I'm sorry. For all of it." Deborah looked down at the card in her hand. Sato Cultural Initiative. A phone number. An address in Tokyo. An email. A way out. A way forward. Scott Hampson had tried to use her heritage as a cage. Instead, he'd handed her the keys to a kingdom he could never enter. 6 months later, Deborah pulled up to the grocery store in Oakland, but she wasn't driving her beat-up Honda anymore. The Sato Initiative had provided a car. Nothing flashy, just reliable and new. More importantly, she wasn't wearing safety-pinned slacks. She was wearing a tailored suit. Professional. Powerful. The kind of outfit that announced you had somewhere to be and something important to do. But today, she was here. The store looked different. There was a new sign above the door, Williams Family Market Oakland Cultural Landmark. The designation had come through last month, thanks to Deborah's position and the initiative's advocacy. It meant the store was protected from seizure, from development, from people like Scott Hampson. It meant her grandfather's legacy was safe. Deborah walked inside. The familiar smell hit her immediately, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery section, the earthy smell of produce, the faint sweetness of the fruit that her mother arranged so carefully every morning. Behind the counter, her mother looked up. Dr. Elena Williams was smiling. Really smiling. The kind of smile Deborah hadn't seen in years. Not since before the medical bills, before the property tax notices, before the weight of potentially losing everything had settled on her shoulders. "Kixim," her mother said softly. "My little one." Deborah felt tears prick her eyes. "Hi, Mom." They embraced over the counter, and for a moment, Deborah let herself feel it. The relief, the joy, the impossible weight that had finally lifted. "I saw the new programs you started," her mother said, pulling back to look at her daughter properly. "The cultural preservation grants. The language education initiatives. The protection for heritage businesses." She shook her head in wonder. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Deborah's eyes drifted to the wall behind the counter. There, in a simple frame, was a photo of her grandmother, Esther, looking regal even in the modest setting of their old apartment. Next to it was a photo of her grandfather, standing in front of this very store on opening day in 1987. "Language is power, Kixim," her grandmother had said. Deborah understood now. Really understood. Scott Hampson had millions. He had expensive suits and watches and investors and all the trappings of success. But Deborah had something he would never have. She had the power to make things happen through the truth of her words. The power to stand tall in her heritage instead of hiding from it. The power to turn what others saw as weakness into her greatest strength. That night at the Gilded Lily, Scott had tried to use her grandmother's language as a weapon. But weapons only work if your opponent doesn't know how to wield them. And Deborah? She'd been trained by masters. "I have a meeting in Budapest next month," Deborah said, watching her mother's eyes light up. "The initiative is opening a new office there. I was thinking, maybe you'd want to come with me? We could visit grandmother's old neighborhood. See where it all started." Her mother's hand went to her heart. "Oh, Deborah. Absolutely yes." Outside, the Oakland afternoon was turning golden. The community garden down the street was thriving. Deborah had helped secure funding for its expansion through her new position. Everything her family had fought to protect was still standing. Everything Scott Hampson had tried to destroy remained. Before leaving, Deborah paused at the photo of her grandmother. She pressed her fingers to her lips, then to the glass. And then, in Hungarian, she whispered the words her grandmother had taught her as a child. "Köszönöm. Mindent megértettem." Thank you. I understood everything. Because in the end, that was the lesson. You don't have to choose between who you are and who you want to become. Your heritage isn't a burden to carry or a shame to hide. It's a foundation to build on. A language to speak truth with. A power that no one, no matter how wealthy, no matter how cruel, can ever take away. Deborah walked out into the Oakland sunshine, ready for whatever came next. She had found her voice, and she would never be silent again. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment where you had to stand up for yourself or your heritage? And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. See you in the next video.